First of all, Runnymede, you probably won't have heard of us. We're on the edge of London in Surrey commuter stock belt, and what the pictures indicate, and we share this, is that every council everywhere has an empty homes problem. It's not unique to the north of England or Glasgow or anywhere else. So what I'm going to do is run through how to gather information from the sources you already have, and I'm going to take questions at the end. So if you don't mind listening to me, that'll be nice. Okay. I'm going to run through a few of the main sources of data that we use for empty homes, and the main ones are the council tax reports for various classes that concern people who want exemptions or discounts because their homes are empty. Usually council tax will be quite responsive to requests for information in the councils, so between yourselves and council tax you should freely get this information, but establish a dialogue with your council tax department first of all. These aren't always in the easiest form for you to use, but once you've got hold of them, they are very useful. So there's two main sources of exemption or discount for people who've got empty homes. One is called Class A exemption or discount, which is where people have said that they want to get their property brought back into a good condition by a major refurbishment, and they should get an exemption or discount for a period of 12 months for that. And that's something that they will present to the council tax department, and that will be confirmed by the council tax department, and then they get this 12 months either without paying council tax or paying less than they would otherwise. And the other major type of exemption or discount is called Class C, and there are various subdivisions of that which I won't bore you with, but mainly Class C is for anybody else for any other reason who can show that they're keeping their property empty, unoccupied for 6 months. And these are time-limited exemptions or discounts. So at the end of those periods, the exemption or discount finishes, although there are certain situations in which it could be renewed, which are going to be confusing, but again, I don't want to really go into here. So we have the 12 months for major refurbishments called Class A, and the 6 months Class C for any other reason to do with the property being unoccupied. So when you get the reports from council tax, they'll show the properties by address and by usually tax band, which is an important feature that we're going to use later on. The other important thing to realise about the reports is they'll indicate not just the address, but the person liable for council tax, and you should immediately notice that that person is probably the owner, but not necessarily. So when you start writing letters and contacting the person, you've only got that name to start with, and so occasionally you'll be getting replies that say, we can't answer for the owner, we're only a tenant, or we're otherwise living in the property but not responsible for it. And obviously then you can follow through with the person that they've identified to find out what that person's planning to do with the property. So anyway, the council tax reports are much the main source of information, but there are some others and some other bits that you need to be aware of. I'll just cover the electoral registration. Every October there's an electoral registration people say that they're living in a property and want to vote in elections. And there's always a question that asks people, is the property vacant on this particular date? The date's 15th of October, and a lot of people will tick that box. Quite often because they don't want to vote and they aren't really troubled, they're abstaining from voting. So you will find a proportion, roughly 1 to 10, where 1 is the truly empty property, or truly empty on the 15th of October, and the other 90% are where people don't want to be bothered to vote and use it as a way of getting out of being on the electoral register. Then the planning register is important as well, because planning applications are being made all the time for properties or land that people want to develop or otherwise alter. And that is a very useful source of information for a large group of properties that are standing empty but are otherwise not recorded elsewhere. And that brings me on to the last category here, properties removed from council tax. Quite often the joint valuation boards in Scotland receive information that say the property can't be occupied, it's beyond economic repair, and that they should be removed from council tax liability. So the assessors, the valuation boards decide that, and then those properties will not appear on the council tax reports as empty. They'll be removed from all council tax liability, and so that is another source of information. I'm not entirely clear how. I think the joint valuation boards and the local authorities in Scotland talk to each other frequently about those properties, and that information is available. Okay. I'll just see, yeah. Before I go on to talk about how we do this work, I just want to pose the question really, why are we doing it? And you really need to consider what your local authority's objectives are in doing work on empty homes. Often you've got an empty home strategy, or at the least a statement that you publish on your website which tells people, residents, why you're interested in empty homes and what processes you're using. So you really need to think through what your local priorities are, and make some sort of statement to the public. There could be a range of priorities. Some of them are fairly obvious. Empty properties in their worst condition are an eyesore, where people have no intention of bringing them back into use. They could devalue nearby properties, and all sorts of smaller reasons, less important reasons. But a fundamental reason is usually that neighbours don't want a problem with the squalor of an empty property, where the garden's overgrown, where roof tiles might slip and fall onto passers-by, or in extreme situations like that. And they also don't want people being attracted to empty properties for criminal reasons. There is a danger people will break into a boarded up property and start using it for all sorts of undesirable reasons. So from that point of view, there is a reason why you do this. So you need to set out your local priorities, and then fundamentally you need to be sure that you've got accurate and topical data so that you can decide on the priorities, the key empty homes that you want to concentrate on. Okay? There might be a few other smaller targets, like developing local initiatives with community partners to bring back properties into use, offering loans to people who've inherited properties to make sure that they can afford the costs of refurbishing, things like that. Those are important as well. Okay. Also, this is more than just a one-off database. You have to keep it updated and you have to take ownership of it, and that means the responsibility falls on you to make sure it's accurate and to try to maintain it. And maintaining it should be easier than starting it, in fact. When you start it, it seems daunting and there is a fair amount of work involved in it, but you have to tailor the work according to the time you can give to it and what resources you have, which I'll go on to a bit later. Okay. So in your packs you should have a series of letters that we've in your shelter bag. There should be some letters and questionnaires, and I'm just going to start running through what they cover. Okay, so if you can see, there's about 6 pieces of paper, and I'm going to start with the first letter and the first questionnaire in a minute. Okay. So now you've got your council tax reports, which are the main source of information. You're going to start to contact the owners or people responsible for council tax and ask them a fundamental question: is your property empty, and why is it empty? Just before I start that, one final point here. You have to balance out what you're doing to enforce action to make sure that the worst problems are dealt with, and what you're trying to do to encourage reoccupation. So there may be, there's swings and roundabouts, carrots and sticks if you like, that you're trying to impress people with what they should be doing, but also supporting them in efforts to bring the properties back into use. So as I say there, they may be stuck for all sorts of reasons. So you have to have a clear idea of how you're going to help them. The first stage is to find out and to put over your position forcibly. But secondly, you go on to be helpful if you can, and also get their confidence in what you're saying. So it's not just beating them over the head with a compulsory purchase order or whatever else, whatever sort of your council wishes to do. Okay, and so we go on to the process then, using the first letter and questionnaire. First of all, you prioritise. You can remove some properties from the list already. There is no easy answer to this. Some may obviously not be your responsibility or should be part of what you're doing. There may be sensitive areas around publicly owned properties. There may be others where you're aware that someone has inherited a property and needs time to get probate and then to deal with grief and the sudden realisation that they now own their mum's house or their grand's house, and you can't just walk in there and start asking them lots of information. I've tried to do this and it doesn't work at all, and it gets you bad vibes. So where you're aware of those, don't contact those properties, but you need to rearrange what you've got left using this letter and this questionnaire. And what this is trying to do is get a quick reply and create an impression, so that they don't just bin this and say, oh, Runnymede Council or West Lothian Council, whatever it is, you know, how dare they? And you often will get this reaction: you've got no right to ask me these personal questions about my property. You know, is this what was I asked last week? Is this a dictatorship? Is this the Dominican Republic or wherever the latest trouble is? You know, is this like something that we've got to do because the government is telling us to do this? So anyway, so you need cooperation and you need to get their confidence. Right, so this letter is a simple letter, just asking you to introduce yourself and ask make a couple of basic points. And then the questionnaire is actually quite formal. We've used it in the past for other reasons. It asks for about what you're doing with the property and why you own the property, and if it's exempt, if it's got certain reasons why it should be exempt from other things that we do in England. But the main thing is to create the impact and to get information on why the property is empty and what they're doing to try to bring it back into use. And we find that this letter and this questionnaire will produce quite a good response, probably 30-40% response just on this letter. Okay? You use an Excel spreadsheet for your replies. You can cut and paste the council tax list into the spreadsheet, and then you add columns for replies and follow-up letters and information. So if you like, you're building up a picture of all the properties, when people replied, what they said they were doing about the properties being empty, and then keeping an analysis which you'll use later in transferring to software, whatever software you have. The spreadsheet's got to be a live file that other officers can use, so you're sharing this with other departments, usually environmental protection, but legal department, planning as well. And if you've got your own private sector housing database, you should think of exporting the data and doing a point score for the homes in worst condition, which is like the properties that are causing the greatest problem and the worst eyesores, and those usually will be very few, but you may be able to prioritise one or two of them for possible compulsory purchase order action. Okay, so the replies fall into four main groups. People will tell you that they're trying to sell the property or find a tenant, and you should be able to tell if it's fairly easy to sell properties in the area, if they're really trying to do that or find a tenant, or whether that's a smoke screen. A lot of people will tell you they're actually doing refurbishment, and those are often the people with the Class A exemptions or discounts. And then the last two, the people are doing refurbishments, but only working slowly or really haven't got enough funds or time or skills to finish those projects. So they're saying that it might finish, but they could well finish after the 12 months period has finished. So they then have to pay full council tax, but they haven't brought the property back into use. And that group you're very interested in. And as I said before, the last group are the people that have inherited property after the owner has died, and often they are stuck, they're not sure at all, and they weren't sort of planning to do this, and they find they're responsible for it. Okay. Okay. Where are we now? So we use follow-up letters when you don't receive replies. Where am I? Sorry. Yeah, sorry, I've gone backwards when I should be going forwards. Sorry about that. What do we do next? Well, after about 3 weeks, you should have got most of the replies you're going to receive. And this will be an interesting pattern. As I say, about 30 to 40% of them will be put onto that spreadsheet and then used further on to follow up some of the information, or people will tell you they're actually reletting the property, be occupied by the end of the month. They've found a buyer, which can be confusing. People just think, well, that's not going to be my responsibility. I can just tell them I found a buyer and that's it. But you need to follow those up and be careful with those, because obviously the buyer may not be moving straight in when he buys the property. He or she buys the property and they may not finish the work that's needed. So it's not straightforward. But obviously the person who is now responsible for council tax could say, well, not my problem anymore, thanks very much. So having used quite a harsh introduction letter to get most replies, you then go on to a softer letter and questionnaire, which should be the second letter and questionnaire in the pack. And you again give 3 weeks for those replies. The softer letter is meant to be more sympathetic, but it does follow up the first one. It refers to the first letter and it sort of reminds people that this is important information. We wouldn't have bothered to send further information out if we didn't think we wanted to know the answer. So, and this questionnaire goes into what we are going to try to do to support them. So if they need money or they need help with finding a tenant, or they need some practical assistance, it's not that we can introduce contractors to them, but we might be able to suggest ways in which they can help themselves with the object of bringing the property back into use. But the most important part of this questionnaire, the second questionnaire, is we're asking a much simpler question now. Is it occupied or empty? And where it's empty and where they don't indicate they want any type of help or advice, we again have to think these may be problems, but people don't want to admit to them, don't want us to get involved. Okay. So we're now going to a few weeks of doing this, and we should have got most of our replies. I would guess it's usually about 70% at this stage have replied to us. Right, which way am I going? So we're going to concentrate on the ones, the 30% or so, that aren't answered, and we're going to investigate them further. There may be some of these replies you've got which suggests that the people are taking longer than they expected, may have a problem bringing the property back into use. And we're going to realise, we're going to work on the basis that some of them may need a follow-up, a separate follow-up to all the letters I've given you, which means if they don't achieve the date they expected, or they didn't have a date that they thought they were going to finish the project by, we need to follow them up. At a reasonable time, we need to ask them, how are you doing? Are you nearer finishing the project? Have you found somebody to live there, or are you letting the property now? Some way of just following up that information, because otherwise you might have got sort of dates in the future from people that people don't achieve for all sorts of reasons. People may want to confuse you by saying, oh, it's going to be finished next month, don't trouble us, we're okay, don't worry. And come 6 months later, they're still not finished. Okay, as I said before, we don't assume that the sale means property is then occupied. We can use the electoral register report to match non-replies. So this will help us to identify properties that are actually empty on that date, the previous year. But as I said at the beginning, this is not going. You'll find the electoral registration report for vacant properties is massive and is 90% people who don't want to vote. But you will correlate, you can cross-check your spreadsheet against those reports to pinpoint the properties that are still empty when you're doing this, which is much later than October the 15th usually. Could be quite a few months later. Where we're going now is to separate the lower value properties from the higher value properties. And I call them bands A to E, but there's usually 8 bands for council tax, A to H. And the lower bands are usually the lower valued properties. So where they haven't replied to either letter or questionnaire, you should then concentrate on those bands. I should have said a bit earlier that the council tax report's not just about the address, who's responsible for the council tax, but it will clearly identify the band for that property, which is a very important feature for you to tell you, is this a terraced house or is this a large detached house, which will make a difference to what you do from now on. Right, am I going the right way? As I said before, you also can get information from council tax on long-term empty homes, properties that have been removed from the council tax database altogether by the valuation boards, or where neighbours have already complained to you or colleagues like environmental protection to say that they are an eyesore, they're boarded up, there's no sign of anybody working in them or anything happening to them. And what we're going to go on to now is contacting neighbours to find out what their problems are. So having got your spreadsheet to this extent, you've got 30% of those reports that haven't replied, and you've used the other information here to identify complaints made to the council about properties. They may not be within that 30%. As I say, there are other places where people record empty properties that could be outside the council tax system. So what we're going to do now is to identify properties, both through the spreadsheet you've got already and those complaints, the properties that have been complained about, and you send a letter to some of the neighbours, and the important neighbours are the ones that live on either side of the property and the ones that live across the road. Those are fundamental. You can try a wider group of neighbours close by, but 3 or 4 neighbours is usually enough. And the electoral registration software now will give you voters in those properties, named people that you will then write to. Okay. Excuse me, I should have switched that off. Sorry about that. Excuse me. So we've got properties that are boarded up and properties that you've identified as probably empty. So we're going to I've lost the plot, sorry, I've lost where I am. And then you have to think about properties that may be empty, but if you've got the time you should actually go and see if they are or not. And then you can go on to properties also that people have complained about and that are in areas of high housing need. So your colleagues might tell you about areas of the town or area where there's acute housing need, where people are in urgent need of separate accommodation, and this would help them if you could identify these properties and put them in touch with the owners or the landlords. Okay, going back to the neighbours, we're going to write to those neighbours and just check what they know of the properties, and by sending that letter we ask them for any information which may be sensitive, which they may not want to reveal to us, but in most cases one or two of the neighbours who are especially troubled by the eyesore or the boarded up property next door will tell you about them and put you in touch with the owners, and you can get some very interesting replies from neighbours about the problems they're having, and they do see what you're doing in a very good light. They're interested that someone is concerned about it at the council and wants to do something to bring the properties back into use. So through your spreadsheet you're building up a picture of the properties that are empty, why they're empty, and also what people intend to do to bring them back into use. And by correlating all that, you can then concentrate on those properties that you haven't heard about, or where people, the neighbours, are having real problems. Again, this is to do with having time to do it, and clearly in Scotland and a lot of England, these are large areas that are difficult, so you have to build in travelling time. You have to consider the limited number of properties you could check this way and spend your time productively. So once you've got this picture, you visit the properties. It's very important to take photos. Photos will be valuable for later reports and for any enforcement action you consider. And you note the conditions, such as the property's boarded up or the garden's overgrown. These can be used in scoring systems, so that on the database you can again identify the worst problems, the properties in the worst conditions, where clearly there's no intention to ever bring them back into use, or they're probably beyond economic repair anyway. So what we're going to go on to now is a final letter. You've built up this picture. You've probably started from about 1% of the entire council tax database. So you're in an area with, say, 30,000 properties. At any one time, there are 300 that will be either exempt or discounted because they're being refurbished or because they're empty. And the final letter in your pack is the one we use at the final stage. It's saying, we haven't heard from you at all. We've got evidence and information that suggests to us that the property isn't being dealt with, it's not being brought back into use. We're giving you a final opportunity to tell us about it, or we're going to officially record your property as empty and one that we're going to deal with. And that relates back to the statement at the beginning, and what you've told residents you're going to do if properties are not being dealt with. You can also use the second questionnaire again, just to reinforce the options and to say this is what you could do. Contact us please to let us know what you are doing. It's deliberately worded aggressively to get them to react to it. You've also checked the council tax name against the land registry at that stage. So you shouldn't just assume it's still the person responsible for council tax. You need to be sure that it is the owner of the property you're writing to. And you need to wrap it up in a coordinated way. You can't just say, we're fed up writing to you, or generally cause them problems. You need to wrap it up within the strategy and the statements that you've already made to the public, so people understand why you're doing this. And often you're going to get a reply of some sort that says, you know, we are trying to deal with this. And actually, in one or two occasions, people will come forward, as some of those pictures indicate, and say, look, we're struggling with this. Can you help us? What do you suggest? Can we get an equity loan to finish this refurbishment? Right. Yeah, I've gone on a bit longer than I thought. I apologise for the interruption. Your information is going to be very effective. It should be accurate, and it should be very useful for what you do to follow up information, to actually take enforcement action or help people in various ways, financially or practically. It's going to be easier to manage from once you've started it, because then you're just dealing with newly exempt or discounted properties. You're not going back over the previous properties. You should have a clear picture of what's happening to those. And you can assess properties in various ways. You use this information in reports. You give analysis of which properties are empty, which areas of the town or area they're empty longest in, why that is, what help people are asking for, if they are at all. And finally, if you like, the handful of properties that aren't going to be turned around, which are causing the most problems, are clearly ones that you may need to tell your members about. You might need to say this house here is never going to be different unless we intervene, which is normally compulsory purchase action, but it could be other sort of less draconian ways of doing it. Okay, and finally then the last thing is an important point to end on. The highly visible long-term empty properties clearly cause concern. Quite often they're going to be published by local newspapers. They might appear on local radio or in regional news programs on television for whatever reason. But they're only a fraction, a handful of all the empty properties in the area. And what you've done is to get a full picture. You haven't just gone to the complaints made by neighbours and assume that's the extent of the problem. It is much wider than that. Okay, thanks very much. Thank you.
I've got one to start off with.
Sure.
You talk about using your database to prioritise empty homes. So how many do you have in your sort of priority list at any one time that you're actively working on?
We're actively, sorry, Kristen, we're actively working on about 30 to 40 out of initial. We have about 30,000 properties in Runnymede, so there are about 300 at any one time that are empty. But we're concentrating on 30 to 40, of which quite a large number are in one ownership, which is a long-term problem we have with one owner who, if you like, is a major philanthropist who owns property inherited and spent a long time bringing them back into use. And sees it as a pet project of his to restore Victorian houses to their original condition. So that's a bit misleading. But you may find there are usually about 30 to 40 in that size of local authority.
You're not full-time on empty homes?
No. I do about 1 day a week on it, and I do other subjects like shared ownership and various other policy issues. So by no means full-time. And that's an important point. You have to tailor what you can do to the time you have and the resource you have. You may need admin support to do this as well. It's useful to have two people, one sending out letters and watching the spreadsheet and dealing with, and you following up the information. And we struggle to go out and visit the properties and take pictures and so on. That's has to be built into the time you've got. And we're only a very small area. From one side to the other is 15 minutes drive, whereas you're typically going to have an hour or two to spend a day out. You've got to make it worth your while, so you have to have a core of properties to visit. You can't go 30 miles for one property, take a photo and come back. That's the day gone. So I realise that.
Are there any other questions for Mike?
Just based on that, how many do you guys bring in back into use? Do you have to keep?
A handful. We use some of the options there to convince people, offer them equity loans. We work in partnership with community groups that offer equity loans. It's very few indeed. But what we're doing is building up a picture and, if you like, making a statement and a presence in a high value area that contains some luxury properties as well as some town centre and terrace properties. So we're making a statement, if you like, and keeping tabs on what's going on out there, and until obviously you have more time to do stuff. You can only do what you've got the time and resources to do. But this seems to be an effective way of doing it. It has been tested in a wider partnership in Surrey and Hampshire, and it works. It works in every sort of area. Yeah, sure.
I'd be interested in knowing how responsive properties that are in the town centre areas, are they more difficult or easier than other areas?
Given that we've got 3 major towns and there's no rural areas, they're all town centre properties, so I'm probably not the best person to ask. But the point I'd make is that in the more remote areas, and I'm thinking of highlands and islands sorts of areas, you may find that properties that stand empty a long time are large detached properties and are related to planning or environmental problems as much as there could, for instance, be some development option that an owner is considering, and it's not economic for them to bring the property back into use. They're talking to planners about the possibility of using the property and its surrounding land for some other purpose. Just speculation on that, but I guess that could affect a number of people in the room. Okay.
Do you have any empty properties that are second homes?
Quite a large number of them will be second homes, and they are confusing when you're trying to do this analysis. They're not usually going to be exempt or discounted. What I'm thinking of is we actually cover an area. The one place you may have heard of in Runnymede is called Virginia Water. I don't know if that's familiar to people, where it's where Sir Bruce Forsyth lives and some famous golfers. It's got Wentworth Golf Course in the middle of the borough, and some of those high value properties are owned by Americans who come over for the summer and then go back. We don't really need to deal with them, and that's why in the presentation I mentioned the bands A to E. If you go to the higher value bands, either you won't get replies or you'll get very unhelpful replies that say, well, this is a second home, or this is somewhere we use occasionally, but we live all around the world. Some people do. Yeah. Yeah.
Does that distinguish between second homes and other types of second homes?
Yeah, why I didn't want to go into Class C is that there are some subdivisions of Class C, which is where properties remain empty and where people every year ask for 6 months exemption or discount because it remains empty. And some of those long-term empty properties, when you get that report, is a massive report, and it's very confusing indeed. Often those properties may be the ones that the planners and the owners are talking about for possible future development, and in other cases they aren't actually empty. It's not a very productive area. If you like, the ones to concentrate on are the ones that are coming to the end of their Class A or Class C periods, and those clearly should be brought back into use, but often won't be. and where those will reveal where the owners have the problems. Yeah, and those within bands A to E of that group are really where the property could well drift into being long-term empty. I haven't got the money to finish this project. I've got other things to do. I'm just, pay your full council tax. That's the other thing people say. Why are you worrying about me? I'm paying your council tax now. You get your council tax from me. Leave me alone. So yeah, it's to do with that. Sure.
Yeah, just some of this. Is the council tax administration slightly different thing? Because these things don't sound familiar in terms of beneficial and getting confused.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, you had a chat with the joint valuation board, and some of it was quite similar, and some of it was
Some of it's similar. You need to check with your joint valuation board and assessors about the way that they deal with properties coming out of council tax and how properties are banded. As far as I was aware, the banding system, the 8 bands, and the class system is similar, but some of the factors may be individual. So a joint valuation board and local authority may be in touch with each other about particular properties, whether they should continue to be liable for council tax and how they might be not liable for council tax. And there's another problem as well, where developers have built homes that aren't able to sell. There could be Class C exemptions or discounts after or for the first 6 months if the market is sluggish. And again, those shouldn't really interest you, but there will be a different sort of dialogue, because in England it's done by Inland Revenue valuation officers, and there's usually quite a good rapport between them. So I'd speak to your valuation board and assessors to make sure that there's a consistent approach, if you can. And that should be, I suppose, your council tax manager, but get involved in that as well. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. I think we need to move on.
Sure, sorry about that.